Good morning. Again, Jim Woodson, who's normally teaching this class, I believe he'll be back next week, or at least that's his plan. He was on schedule last time I talked to him. We're going to be looking into the book of Ezra today, starting in the fourth chapter. Where I left off, I believe it was around verse 11, so that's where we're going to be starting. Before we get started, I've asked Jim Woolley to lead us in prayer.
Shall we pray? Most kind, loving Heavenly Father, we thank you for our class today. We thank you for our teacher. Bless him with the knowledge that he knows, that he studied, and he can enlighten us, remind us, encourage us. Forgive us of our many sins. In Jesus' Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, starting in verse 11, let's go ahead and read till verse 23, which is pretty much not quite the end of the chapter, but it's pretty close. To King Artaxerxes, from your servants, the men of the region beyond the river, and so forth. Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem and are building the rebellious and evil city, and are finishing its walls and repairing the foundations. Let it now be known that to the king that, if this city is built and the walls completed, they will not pay tax, tribute, or custom, and the king's treasury will be diminished. Now, because we receive support from the palace, it is not proper, or was not proper for us to see the king's dishonor. Therefore, we have sent and informed the king that searches may be made in the book of the records of your fathers. And you will find in the book of the records and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces, and that they have incited sedition within the city in former times, for which cause the city was destroyed. We informed the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, the result will be that you will have no dominion beyond the river. The king sent an answer to Rehum the commander, to Shimshai the scribe, and to the rest of their companions who dwell in Samaria, and to the remainder beyond the river, peace and so forth. The letter which you sent us has been clearly read before me, and I gave command, and a search has been made, and it was found that this city in former times has revolted against kings, and rebellion and sedition has been fostered in it. There have also been mighty kings over Jerusalem who have ruled over all the region beyond the river, and tax, tribute, and custom were paid to them. Now give the command to make these men cease, that this city may not be built until the command is given by me. Take heed now that you do not fail to do this. Why should damage increase to the hurt of the kings? Now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum, Shimshai, and the scribe, and their companions, they went up in haste to Jerusalem against the Jews, and by force of arms made them cease. Now, earlier in this chapter, opposition began as early as the return led by Zerubbabel. And this continued throughout the reigns of Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes I. This latest attempt was centered more on stopping the rebuilding of the wall, but it did affect the rebuilding of the temple. As a side note, notice that there were periods of opposition actually encompassed decades, these periods of opposition. It's theorized that the writer, who's Ezra, was just kind of reviewing these events for people who already had lived through it, so it was all in the past to them. Also, at the time of this letter, opposition letter, the temple had already been rebuilt. If we go to just verse 24, let's finish this. Thus the work of the house of God which is at Jerusalem ceased, and it was discontinued until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. This verse actually brings us back then to the time that's documented in the beginning of the chapter. So you can see from that the enemies of God actually won this battle. If you want to think of it that way, as the work of the temple did halt. but only the foundation had been laid at this point. And it sat there for about 15 years until the reign of King Darius the first, and that's when it continued. So if we just kind of think about chapter 4, there's some applications we can gather from this. We can, when we look at this, we can see that we can expect that there's going to be opposition to God's work, no matter no matter how we feel about it. There's going to be some opposition. In fact, it's probably a good. It's a good sign that you're doing God's work if there's opposition, because the world's not going to fight something that it's wanting to have done. Maybe we're not going to go through quite the things that they did in the days of Ezra, but there is going to be opposition. Also, the opposition, if you think about it, there was a lot of opposition in the first century. And they went through a lot, even more than what was going on in Ezra's time. Hopefully we'll never experience that kind of opposition, but we need to be ready for it and have courage and confidence God's going to get through it, or get us through it. We also need to understand that God's work can be stalled. So we don't necessarily want to be discouraged if opposition tends to put things on hold. God's work will get done. We just need to have faith. Let's go ahead and go to chapter 5 and start with the first 5 verses there. Then the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophets, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them. Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Zozadak, rose up and began to build the house of God, which is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, helping them. At the same time, Tattenai, the governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar-Boznai and their companions came to them and spoke thus to them: "Who has commanded you to build this temple and finish the wall?" Then accordingly, we told the names of the men who were constructing this building, but the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, so that they could not make them cease till a report could go to Darius. Then a written answer was returned concerning this matter. We can see that at this time the Jews had the courage to go ahead and do what they knew they needed to do, whether they had the permission of the king or not. New opposition did come up, and another request was made to the king at this point. But the people didn't succumb to the pressure at this point. So the people at this, they'd learned how to handle the pressure and the opposition that they were going through. If we go from there and look at the return letter, starting in verse 6. This is a copy of the letter that Tattenai sent. The governor of the region beyond the river and Shethar-Boznai and his companions, the Persians who were in the region beyond the river, to Darius the king. All peace, let it be known that to the king that we went into the province of Judea to the temple of the great God, which is being built with heavy stones, and timbers being laid in the walls, and its work goes on diligently and prospers in our hands. Then we asked these elders and spoke to them thus to them: "Who commanded you to build this temple and to finish these walls?" We also asked them their names to inform you, that we might write the names of the men who were chief among them. And thus they returned us an answer, saying, "We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and completed. But because our fathers provoked the God of heaven to wrath, he gave them into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this temple and carried the people away to Babylon. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to build this house of God. and also the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple that is in Jerusalem and carried into the temple of Babylon, those King Cyrus took from the temple of Babylon, and they were given to one named Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor. And he said to them, "Take these articles, go, carry them to the temple, since that is in the temple site that is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt on its former site." Then the same Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundation of the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. But from that time, even until now, it has been under construction and is not finished. Now, therefore, if it seems good to the king, let a search be made in the king's treasure house, which is there in Babylon, whether it is so that a decree was issued by King Cyrus to build this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send us his pleasure concerning this matter. So we can pretty well see at this point that another request was sent to do another search. And we'll get into the answer that comes back in just a minute. But it's interesting to me that the meat of the original response from King Cyrus is actually in this letter. So they already know that there was an initial request to build this temple. If you look at just this chapter and the applications of the chapter, it's at this time when they were confronted with opposition, the leaders were polite, but they continued to work. And that's kind of how we have to look at how we react to opposition. We need to be polite, especially when it's concerning governments and things like that. But we do need to have faith and have enough of a backbone to continue the work as we need to. And we also need to remember to keep the big picture in mind. There's going to be times when parts of what we're trying to do can't be done, but we need to try to persevere and continue and avoid the disappointments that we know are going to happen. So let's go on to chapter 6. So starting in verses 1 through 5, we're going to get the decree that came back. Then King Darius issued a decree, and a search was made in the archives where the treasures were stored in Babylon. And at Achmetha, in the palace that is in the province of Media, a scroll was found, and in it a record was written thus: In the first year of King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where they offered sacrifices, and let the foundations of it be firmly laid, the height 60 cubits and its width 60 cubits, with 3 rows of heavy stones and 1 row of new timber. Let the expenses be paid from the king's treasury. Also let the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple, which is in Jerusalem, and brought to Babylon, be restored and taken back to the temple, which is in Jerusalem, each to its place, and deposit them in the house of God. What I find very interesting in here is that not only was we don't know for sure if the initial decree, I assume it contained this information, but we weren't given all of it before because we weren't told about the dimensions that the king had in here. It's thought that these dimensions were probably more of a maximum size because if you look at the dimensions, they actually would be bigger than the temple that Solomon put together. So it's probably he was just saying it can't be any bigger than the 60 cubits by 60 cubits. Also, let's go ahead and go to 6 through 12. Now, therefore, Tattenai, governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar-Boznai, and your companions, the Persians who are beyond the river, keep yourselves far from there. Let the work of this house of God let the work of this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God on its site. Moreover, I issued a decree as to what you shall do for the elders of these Jews for the rebuilding of this house of God. Let the costs be paid at the king's expense from taxes on the region beyond the river. This is to be given immediately to these men so that they are not hindered. And whatever they need, young bulls, rams, and lambs for the burnt offerings of the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, and oil, according to the request of the priests who are in Jerusalem, let it be given them day by day without fail, that they may offer sacrifices of sweet aroma to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. Also, I issue a decree that whoever alters this edict, let a timber be pulled from his house and erected, and let him be hanged on it, and let his house be made a refuse heap because of this. And may the God who causes his name to dwell there destroy any king or people who put their hand to alter it, or destroy this house of God which is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, issue a decree, let it be done diligently. This is really kind of a very powerful section of the book of Ezra, in my opinion, because not only are they given the right and order to go ahead and work and finish the temple, but these men who had opposed this are now being told to support it with money, with offerings, and whatever else is necessary. So I think that's kind of a very interesting part of this. It may sound a little strange if you kind of think about it, for a foreign king to want to support the worship of the Jews, but really in this time and place, the Persian kings actually did have a tendency to want to support their captive people's religious habits. So it's not unusual for them to do it, but I think it is unusual for them to support it with kind of the terms that they did it in this case. I guess I didn't bring that up. If anybody has any questions or comments, please raise your hand. Jim, I'll come get that in just a second. Let's go ahead and read just a small section, reading verses 13 through 18 on the rebuilding of the temple. Then Tattenai, governor of the region beyond the river, Shethar-Boznai and their companions diligently did according to what King Darius had sent. So the elders of the Jews built, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo, and they built and finished it according to the commandments of the God of Israel, and according to the command of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, the king of Persia. Now the temple was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of Darius. Then the children of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the descendants of the captivity celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. And they offered sacrifices at the dedication of this house, 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. They assigned the priests to their divisions and the Levites to their divisions over the service of God in Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. So we can see that the temple was rebuilt, and like I said, it was rebuilt. It was finished mainly because of the idea that God supported it, but the idea that the king was told these governors to support it in physical terms definitely had a help. The next section is talking about the celebration of the Passover. So let's go to 19 through 22. And the descendants of the captivity kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. For the priests and the Levites had purified themselves All of them were ritually clean, and they slaughtered the Passover lambs for all the descendants of the captivity, for their brethren the priests, and for themselves. Then the children of Israel who had returned from the captivity ate together with all who had separated themselves from the filth of the nations of the land in order to seek the Lord God of Israel. And they kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with joy, for the Lord had made them joyful, and turned the heart of the king of Assyria toward them to strengthen their hands in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. So, really at this point, all we're getting out of this is that the Levites had been purifying themselves, and they were able to celebrate the Passover. So I'm sure having the temple ready and doing the Passover was a big deal for them at this point. If we, sorry, I kind of lost my place. So if we look at, If we look at this starting from Ezra 4, verse 8, and going through 6 through verse 18, and again some verses in chapter 7, these verses were actually written in Aramaic instead of Hebrew, which is kind of interesting, but maybe not unexplainable. Hebrew obviously is what most of the Old Testament was written in. But these were written in Aramaic, but that might make sense from the standpoint of there were several letters included in this, and those were written in Aramaic, so they just put the surrounding information in Aramaic also. But it is very fitting that this section, since it concerns the observation, the observation of the Passover, that it be in Hebrew. I'm trying to put applications in at the end of each chapter. This may be just a little bit of a stretch, but the statement in verse 6, where they're told to stay away from there, maybe that's something we as Christians should keep in mind, but from a different standpoint. There are definitely places and things in this world that we need to keep far from. Things that might cause us to sin. So it's something we need to consider. Don't go near something if there's a chance that you're going to be tempted into sinning. Also, keep in mind, especially in worship, our lives need to be acceptable, and our worship has to be acceptable to God and being in spirit and truth. Both are necessary to be pleasing. So just being right but not having the Spirit's not going to be enough. And we also, if you look at the world, there's a lot of religious organizations out there who think that they can do anything they want as long as they do it, in the name of God, and they, do it with Spirit. Well, you've got to have both. You've got to have Spirit, and you've also got to have the truth. I'm sure at this point, during this time after the temple was finished, that these people were very, very relieved and happy that they were able to finish something, because it took a long time for them to do this. And plus, they also went through an awful lot of opposition in order to get through it. Instead of going on to Ezra chapter 7, there's actually two sections of Ezra. The first section, which is concerning the rebuilding of the temple, the second section actually takes place about 60 years later. And that's how Ezra renewed the worship, the Jewish worship practices. But between those two times, we actually find out that the book of Esther was actually taking place at that time. So I was kind of hoping we could skip over to Esther and kind of go into some of that at this point. So if you'll go with me to the book of Esther, starting in chapter 1. There are some things about Esther that are interesting before we actually get into the book itself. There's a lot of differences Esther's a little different from most of the books of the Old Testament, or most of the books of the Bible, actually. There are very few books that are named after women, for starters. But it's also, and I haven't myself gone in and double-checked this, but according to what I've read, God's not really mentioned in the book of Esther. And that is extremely unusual for the Old Testament. This book is also, it's very much a dividing book to many people. The Jewish scholars, or the Jewish scholar Maimonides, he thought that the book of Esther was important enough that it ranked just behind the Torah in importance. That's pretty high. But kind of looking at it from the opposite end, Martin Luther, who was a religious scholar, obviously, said that he wished the book had never even been given to the world. That's about as far apart in attitudes as you can get. Esther is actually still, the actions of Esther are still a part of Jewish life today. My understanding is this book is read once a year during the Feast of Purim, which is actually talked about in the book at the end. There's really little known about who wrote the book of Esther. It's kind of thought that maybe Mordecai, who's mentioned obviously in the book, wrote the book, but there's really nothing that helps us understand who wrote it. The book was written around 480 BC, so that gives us a time frame. The book raises some interesting questions if you want to look at it. Was a commendable thing for Queen Vashti, which we're going to get into in just a minute, but was a good thing for her, or was a commendable thing for her to refuse to parade herself in front of the guests at the king's banquet? And then, obviously, was it the right thing for her to lose her place when she refused? Another question is, should Esther have allowed herself to be a part of this search for a new queen, which was kind of, if you want to look at it, kind of a beauty pageant. She wasn't forced to do that. She was it was a suggestion, I guess, but she wasn't forced. Should Esther have married a foreigner? Jewish women were not necessarily supposed to be marrying women outside of the Jewish, outside of Jewish. Should Esther have withheld her nationality from her husband? She didn't tell him she was a Jew. It's kind of an interesting question. And should Esther and Mordecai have requested permission at the end of the book? They requested the permission from the king to slaughter, if you will, the enemies of the Jews. Is that the right thing to have happened? So there's some questions that this book brings up. I'm not going to necessarily answer those, but they are good questions. So let's go to Esther 1, and we'll start in verse 1, going through 1 through 4. So now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that is, the third year of his reign, he made a feast for all its officials and servants. The powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces before him. when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. The beginning of this book actually, especially this chapter, does set up what follows later, why there's a search for a new queen and things like that. So it is an important chapter, but it also kind of gives us a glimpse into King Ahasuerus' court and how he treated his nobles. King Ahasuerus is probably better known in most circles by his Greek name, which is Xerxes the First. We can see by reading this that the size and splendor of the Persian Empire at this point was pretty amazing. It's interesting that this is a 6-month banquet. That had to be quite a gathering. Starting in verse 5, let's go to 9. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple on silver rods and marble pillars. And the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So we're going to find out here in a minute. Let's see. Well, let's go ahead and keep reading a little bit. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehumam, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abictha, Zithar, and Carcass. These names are definitely easy. 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing her royal crown in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come to the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore, the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. So, as we've read, after the 6-month feast ended, the king actually hosted a 7-day feast. And this was for everyone, pretty much, that was at the citadel, from richest to poorest. These people, it wasn't just the nobles at this point. This was everyone. It's thought that the reason of the descriptions that were made of this banquet was to show the splendor of the citadel. I find it interesting that the amount of wine consumed was specified, and that each could determine how much they wanted to consume. That does make me wonder if everyone at the 6-month feast, if they were allowed to drink all they could, or if they had specific amounts that they were supposed to drink. Probably the significance of us being told that Queen Vashti gave her own feast for the women in the palace was to show that there were no women at the feast given by the king, which wasn't always the case, but in this case, they were separated. It's obvious that the king was trying to impress everyone at the feast, and that to that end, he brought his his wife, who was very beautiful, it was probably not to benefit her, not to show her, the things that were going on in his presence, but it was more of a, hey, look who I got to marry me type situation. The king's anger is maybe a little understandable because kings aren't normally used to having people say no to him. And she kind of embarrassed him, if you want to think of it that way. He was in front of all the people of the citadel, and he ordered her to come, and she said no. That would have embarrassed him quite a bit. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that she should have gone and paraded herself in front of these people, but just understand that her refusal probably didn't look too good on him. Also remember that it states that the king was merry with wine. I think that's a euphemism for he was drunk, okay? So both the action, if you want to think about it, and the anger are kind of probably brought about more by the alcohol than anything else. It's an interesting question as to why we think Vashti refused to go to the king. There are a lot of people in religious circles today that actually hold up Queen Vashti as an example to women, as to how you act in public. Don't parade yourself and things like that. Keep yourself pure, which is obviously a very good thing. But I read an interesting possibility. She might have refused more because she was having her own feast, which kind of put her at the important spot of that feast. And then these 7 eunuchs, these 7 men come in and pretty well tell her that the king says, come now. And she might have been, kind of embarrassed a little bit to be treated that way in front of her guest. So she might have refused simply out of pride. I mean, there's just no way to really know. But it's still a good thing to bring to as an example that that we need to make sure we do the things we need to do. Don't just do something that somebody says. Make sure you're doing the right thing. Let's go on to verses 13 through 22. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Karshena, Shethnar, Abmatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to law? Because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report. King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree which he made is proclaimed throughout all the empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small." And the reply pleased the king, and the princes and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his house and speak the language of his own people. I think this section of Scripture shows that the king's pride was very much affected. But not only just the king's pride, but there was all the other men in attendance believed that this was a bad thing. They were very worried that if the king let the queen get away with this, that other women would refuse requests from their husbands. Sounds a little bit like, I guess, the kind of the women's suffrage movement, if you will, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, where women were treated a little differently then than they are now. The consequences of her refusal was that she would never again come into the presence of the king and that her position would be given to another. It's not stated that she was removed from the king's harem. Nothing stated that anything physical happened to her. It's just that her position as the number one wife was taken away and given to somebody else. The last couple of verses, I think, are intended to assure the men of the kingdom that they should be master of their own house, which is just kind of keeping the status quo. And this is what the king was doing in his own house. Since this is the end of the chapter, there are several things we could look at as far as applications here. I already mentioned that Queen Vashti is kind of held as an example to how Christians, and especially Christian wives, should react in similar situations today. I think it is right that women should put their purity and beliefs first. But if you read Esther carefully, the writer of Esther is not necessarily showing approval or disapproval of the action. He's just, the writer is just saying what the action was. So we don't know whether the writer of this book thought it was the right thing to do or not. I think it's just best for us to look to Christ and not necessarily to look to Esther or Vashti as an example. Much better to look at Christ and how He would want us to act, and use that, not a queen who we really don't know the situation exactly. There is a lesson here for those, if you want to think about it, those who drink to excess. That it tends to lead to stupid decisions, if you will. There are things that are going to affect you, but there are also things that are going to affect. These decisions don't just affect you, I guess is what I'm trying to say. They affect others around you. And these effects could go on for the rest of your life. Who knows if this would have even happened if the king hadn't been drunk? He probably would have thought better of asking Queen Vashti to even do this. So if you look at it from that standpoint, his drinking probably caused a lot of this. Lastly, for an application, this is a good example, if you will, of how pride of life can be a real problem for people. King Ahasuerus obviously was very proud of his palace. He was proud of his kingdom, and he wanted to show it off. And again, if you look at it from the standpoint of how sin is, I mean, if in 1 John 2 verse 16, it says, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the fathers, but is of the world." So this is a kind of a reminder to us that we need to look at things here on this earth not as things that we've done, but as things that God has given us. If he had looked at this, at his kingdom and all that he had as things that God had given him, he would have reacted a lot differently. He wouldn't have been trying to impress everybody. He wouldn't have been trying to show off his wife, if you will, things like that. So there are a lot of things in this chapter that, if he had just done a few things differently, a lot of differences would have been made. I know it's a little early, but the next thing would be starting a new chapter, so I don't know that I want to get too much into it. So is there any questions or comments? Okay, well, I think I'll just release you just a few minutes early then. Thank you.